The true goal of this series is to get the opponent to move their sword downwards away from their chest. The first part is just a setup to trick them into doing so, but you still want to have high odds on landing your setup. I'm going to give a simple summary of what needs to be done, and then cover a more in-depth breakdown. Let's begin with the summary. You will use your dagger to lift their blade and cut their newly exposed wrist with the rising cut. Then when they move their sword downwards to recover, cover your blade or attack, thrust them in the chest while their sword is moving further away from your true target. Now let's get to the full breakdown. The first goal and setup of the series is to get them to expose their wrist and bring it closer to your sword, making it easier to cut. You do this by reaching upwards for their sword with your dagger from underneath. This usually promotes 3 different scenarios. 1, they pull their sword up away from your dagger, which exposes the wrist to be cut. 2, you capture their sword and lift it up, exposing the wrist to be cut. Or 3, you capture their sword and lift it up, exposing the wrist to be cut, and they fight against it and bring their sword downwards. Shortly after we begin our dagger movement is when you're going to throw your rising cut targeting the wrist. This cut can keep you safe if they attack, and it can hit them if they don't attack. A lot of people will notice the sword rising and pull their sword downwards to cover it or recover. This is exactly what you want because it brings the wrist closer towards your goal. Plus, it brings their weapon away from the chest, which is your true target, and it locks their weapon in tempo. Once their sword is low enough from the chest, thrust your sword forward while covering their sword with your dagger. A lot of times this ends up being a cross parry. For this next version, you'll be targeting the leg instead of the chest, because it forces their offhand to have to travel a lot of distance in order to stop your attack. Plus, if they attack or retreat, it can bring their leg closer to your weapon, and the front leg is usually the last segment to move if they do retreat. You'll also be getting their sword to move away from their leg. You'll be using the dagger rising cut setup from earlier to get to high guard. One of the reasons you want to be in high guard is because to cover your sword they need to be in mid guard. Them being in mid guard encourages them to use their sword instead of their dagger to parry their right side because it's closer. The reason you don't just start in high guard is because it's too obvious and makes people more cautious. Cutting to high guard deeper in the exchange will hide your intent a bit more. Let's dig into the breakdown. Same as before, you'll use your dagger to lift their blade and cut their newly exposed wrist with the rising cut. But this time you'll cut all the way to high guard, ending with the sword above your shoulder. Then throw a descending cut to your left as a feint between 9 and 11 o'clock to get the opponent to parry his sword out and to the right. When he parries, avoid it by leaning slightly to the left, which will change the angle of the sword to slightly miss the enemy's parry, then thrust to the leg. If they go to parry your leg shot, you can rotate your hand counterclockwise and bring your sword tip up and thrust. For this next version, after your rising cut to high guard, you will cross parry with your dagger under your sword and then attack with your sword above your dagger, either as a thrust or a cut. You can do this with or without leaning to the left. This version works great if your opponent attacks you as you move or are in high guard, or if they simply just have their sword extended. The logic behind this series is that from high guard you promote them to attack, which gets them to move their weapon away from your target, which in this case is the right side of the upper torso. Another reason you target the right side is because their dagger has a further distance to travel to parry it, and if they do get the parry, there is a high chance of them pushing it into their arm. The other reason you target the right side is because when they attack it brings the right side closer to you. So in this case, you've gotten them to move their main weapon away from your target, gotten them to move your target closer to you, and made their last form of defense have too far to travel, while forcing them to risk pushing their own blade into themselves. Some important things to note. A lot of times you can land this series even without the opponent moving their sword a lot. The reason is it can lock out an entire side and can attack at angles that sneak through small holes. Some other important things to note is if they parry your sword, you can just follow up with a dagger attack. Let's talk about whether you should start in low guard or mid guard. If you start in low guard, the opponent is more likely to bring their sword downwards than upwards after you try and capture it. This is because they will try to cover your sword. Since it's coming from low, logically, they will move their sword low to cover or block it. If you start in mid guard, when you go to capture their sword with your dagger, they're more likely to pull their sword back and away from your dagger to keep the higher line closed. Keep this in mind for which target you pick and try and hit, since you want their sword to move away from your target. This means low guard is better for Series A. The reason is, when you go to take their sword and they bring their sword down, they will then want to bring it back up. And when they pull their arm back up, it makes it easier to hit. Plus, with their sword moving down, it makes anything on the upper body easier to hit. Midguard is better if you're trying to land the setup part of the series, because they will pull their sword back and expose the wrist more, plus your sword is closer to their wrist. Also, since they're more likely to pull their sword back, this makes it easier to land the shot we went through in Series B, which is the leg. A good way to think about it and review is, if you cut up and their sword goes down, then do Series A and thrust to the new opening, which is above. If you cut up and their sword goes up, then do Series B because the leg is exposed. Or if when you go to take their sword and it goes up, you can also just go straight to the leg and skip high guard altogether. One of the cool things about this series is if when you go to take their sword and they move their sword down and you go to Series B, high guard, then when they move their sword back up, now they're fighting momentum from going down, then back up, and they'll have to go down again to stop your leg attack. There's one more variation I'll cover to help you understand some footwork options. Start in midguard and advance your front foot forward while attempting to capture their blade with your dagger. At the same time, drop your sword low. Next, throw the rising cut to distract them and hide the fact that your back foot is moving up. If you do it right, they will be too distracted by the cut to see how far you brought your back foot up, stealing range. Once the back foot lands, throw your lunge or attack with cover.